Perhaps you have heard the rumors. Russia has plans to mobilize 500,000 soldiers in 2 months. And one of the more audacious strategies here is to use them to invade part of a Baltic country. Let's save the discussion of the plausibility of both of those steps for tomorrow on the main channel. For now, it is time for friends of NATO to pick up the phone, because today's geopolitics helpline is about to start. In the unlikely event where NATO finds itself under attack from Russia in Europe, how prepared is the alliance to fight as one force, and not as many different countries with different interests? The last time there was a continent-wide conflict was World War II, and the Allies then frequently acted in their own interests, to the detriment of the alliance as a whole. I am less worried about coordination among the Allies, and more worried about their willingness to coordinate. And I thank this viewer for the $10 bribe, which indeed succeeded in getting my attention. My questionable integrity aside, this question hits on a critical point in international relations. Threats and intent are virtually irrelevant compared to follow-through. You can have this wonderful Article 5 that says an attack on one is an attack on all, but that is meaningless if no one does anything about it following an attack. Article 5 does have some direct causal effect. It establishes a system of reciprocation. If you view the alliance as a long-run agreement, my failure to help you in a time of need will be punished by the rest of the alliance, because the next time that I am attacked, no one will help me. However, just because that system works in theory does not guarantee that it will work in practice. There would be a temptation from impatient and weak allies who lack resolve to ignore the first attack against someone else. Essentially, they sign the document believing that they will get some benefit if they are the first to be attacked. And if they are not, then no harm, no foul. Lots of harm and lots of foul from the perspective of the rest of the alliance, but not for that particular state. And that is why merely having a treaty on collective defense does not guarantee collective defense in practice. We are once again stuck tapping the sign. Fortunately, NATO is not just a treaty. Article 5 gets all of the public attention, but it is a small fraction of how the alliance draws not only its own credibility, but also its power. To discuss the details of what I mean by that, we have to split the conversation in two. Indeed, if you are like the viewer and are still worried that individual alliance members will act in their own self-interest if Russia were to attack, then there are two types of possible attacks that Russia could make, each with distinct considerations for NATO. One possibility is a large-scale invasion of Europe, effectively what we would think of as World War III. The other option is a small-scale, irregular operation where Russia attempts to seize a border town or two along the Baltics. Let me start with the large invasion because that one will be easier. This one I am not worried about because it has always been central to NATO's game plan, and they have developed systems to resolve the cooperation dilemma. This is hard to appreciate if you live in the United States. The US military demands that it be a one-stop shop. If there is some type of military need, the United States can almost certainly do it to some degree. That is much less the case inside of Europe, particularly after you look past the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. The example that I frequently use here, and thus you may already be familiar with, is the Baltic states' lack of true navies. They intentionally forego sea power because they are more concerned about the land border with Russia. If you travel further west, those countries do not have as strong infantry units because they do not share a border with Russia. They can therefore spend more money on things like naval ships or air power. As a result, both halves of the alliance are vulnerable if one of them were to fail to follow through on their alliance commitments. Given the viewer's concern, this may sound like a bad way to design an alliance, because if one of them decides not to show up, then you might be screwed. But here's the thing. If one does not show up for the other when the other is under attack, then Russia destroys the other because the other is missing the thing that the first one has. Well, think about what happens next. Russia has taken over the Baltics and then looks west and notices that the infantry from those countries is weak. Russia has a much easier path to continue its invasion plan. Consequently, each country does not need to be worried about the other's follow-through. No one is helping out just because it is the right thing to do, or it would be a nice favor for a friend. They have to do it out of their own self-interest. And that is the beauty of the design of NATO. It is what separates this alliance from every other alliance ever created. NATO is not some mere ad hoc coalition formalized by a treaty. It is a complete restructuring of military investment. Article 5 gets all of the fame, but the genius comes from designing the credibility of it. I might need to be bribed to answer questions, but fortunately, allies do not need to be bribed to come to a partner's defense. Now, all of this presupposes that the defense will be effective. 32 allies, all with separate systems, trying to interoperate with one another. The viewer's question presupposed that this was not an issue, and that was generally a good assumption. We could spend many separate videos discussing how NATO solves those problems, and in fact we have, but suffice it to say, for our purposes here, they even coordinate in the field on the development of new projects. You can see that work in action from these photos of Allied Command Transformations Task Force X, which recently expanded its footprint into the Mediterranean. You might recall that we have been following developments there since last summer, after I visited ACT's headquarters, back when the project was still focused on security in the Baltic Sea. The good news here is that a large invasion of Europe is the more serious threat. The bad news is that it is the less likely threat. For that to happen at all, Russia would need to engage in a new round of mass mobilization, and likely not the one that Ukraine keeps referencing. Raising the proper army would require politically convincing Russian citizens of some threat to the Federation coming out of the West. It is something that could plausibly happen even if the odds are low. That is why NATO commanders are cautious in how they respond to the incursions that Russia has made over the last year or so, not wanting to give the Kremlin the propaganda ammunition that it might be seeking. In contrast, the second option of a targeted takeover operation of a small chunk of NATO territory would be much easier for Russia to attempt. The reason that this is concerning is that it does not carry with it the same type of existential threat that the previous case did. Once again, poor Estonia invited me to their humble country last winter, and all I have done in response is make them the frequent target of a hypothetical Russian attack, if for no other reason than I have the B-roll for it. Nonetheless, Narva, on Estonia's eastern border with Russia, is the most frequently cited point of a Russian attack. Just imagine for a moment. You went to bed tonight and woke up and found out that Narva was now in Russia's hands. How does that directly affect Latvia's security? How does that directly affect Germany's security? How does that directly affect Spain's security? Before, those countries had to be concerned about a domino problem. If Estonia as a whole falls, that leaves Central Europe in greater danger, which could then lead Western Europe into greater danger. Narva, on the other hand, is virtually irrelevant to that calculation. The problem here is that there are dozens of Narvas all over the place along the eastern flank, and after Narva is no longer a NATO city, the next city west could be the following Narva. You blink, and suddenly half of Estonia has been salami sliced away. This, it should be noted, is the far more common way that states have tried to acquire territory since the end of World War II. It is basically the Crimea playbook, instead of the cluster fun of whatever you call the current war in Ukraine. The solution here is trickier. Option 1 is to employ tripwire forces up and down the entirety of the eastern flank. Indeed, such forces expanded in the immediate aftermath of Russia's annexation of Crimea, and later the invasion of Ukraine. Option 2 is to have your intelligence agencies be on top of Russian troop movements, and have an agile response force capable of rapidly turning into a counterforce wherever the threat arrives. Clearly, the latter comes with inherent risks. The former presupposes that tripwires will create credibility, and for all of the discussion earlier, there are question marks there. I may want to establish a tripwire in Narva, so that Russia thinks that if my forces die, I will have no choice politically but to respond with expansive countermeasures, that will then make the effort not worthwhile for Russia. If all of those calculations work out, you will successfully deter Russia from trying in the first place. But you could also see how the domestic conversation could turn back to the point about Narva not being a direct strategic concern. Thus, I lose a dozen soldiers, and we quietly retreat with maybe a couple of bombs lobbed as some minimal political cover. Again, this is easier for Russia, and it is less consequential for the West. But it creates much bigger problems a few steps down the line, which is why NATO rhetoric explicitly discusses defending every square inch of NATO territory, or square centimeter for that matter. And because of Russia's ease of attempting such an incursion, NATO countries have to think more actively about the problem now, because it is the type of thing that could happen in relatively short order. Thanks again to the viewer for the bribe. It is especially effective when the question that follows is so interesting. Meanwhile, there are a bunch of other interesting questions back in the Geopolitics Helpline archive. Click here to see all of them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.